Hello, I'm Sophia, and this is The World Unpacked. Today, we're examining the evolving relationship between the United States and Latin America under President Donald Trump's second term. I think it's fair to say that this has been an area of focus for this new administration. Donald Trump has mentioned Latin America more than any other region in his inaugural address. Marco Rubio's first foreign trip as Secretary of State was to the region, with stops in Panama, El Salvador, Costa Rica, Guatemala, and the Dominican Republic. Is that right?
That's right.
Much has happened regarding U.S. policy toward Latin America since Trump took office. We've had aggressive migrant deportations, coercive economic measures from the U.S., and all of that has impacted bilateral relations, with potentially shifting global alliances and partnerships as a consequence of that. Joining us today is my colleague Oliver Stuenkel, who is an expert on Latin American politics and foreign policy, and I'm so glad to have him here to talk through all of the issues.
Thank you for having me.
All right, so Oliver, let's start with something that most of our listeners will have seen, the recent clash between U.S. President Donald Trump and Colombian President Gustavo Petro. A few months ago, right after his inauguration, they engaged in a pretty public spat on social media on deportation policies, specifically over U.S. military flights bringing deported migrants back to Colombia. What happened, first of all, and then more importantly, what does it tell us about the broader U.S. approach to Latin America under this president?
So I think U.S. foreign policy towards Latin America touches on key issues of domestic U.S. politics and a lot of issues that Trump emphasized even during the campaign. Latin America is intimately tied to a lot of domestic challenges like migration, drug trafficking, transnational crime. So I think that explains in part why for the Trump administration, Latin America is so important. We also have, the first Spanish-speaking Secretary of State. He's the son of Cuban migrants. So that's why I think Latin America looms large, has appeared numerous times during the campaign trail. And I think that what happened in Colombia was a reflection of a very contentious relationship between the United States and Latin America at this stage, particularly vis-a-vis migration. It's important to remember that this is also for a lot of Latin American countries an issue of economic importance, particularly in Central America. Migrants who are in the United States send a lot of money through remittances back to their home countries. Migration is important to reduce pressure on labor markets. But at the same time, cooperation is crucial to combat a lot of the challenges that both the United States, but especially Latin American countries face, like the prevalence and growing power of organized crime. So in the case of Colombia, the Trump administration, it seems to me, has obviously talked a lot about mass deportations, and a sizable part of the people in the United States without legal documentations hail from Latin America. But it's also very tricky to implement mass deportation. So it seems like the core element of the Trump strategy vis-a-vis immigration has been to dissuade people from coming to the United States rather than actually expelling lots of people, which is quite expensive. So what the Trump administration has done initially is to kind of organize high-profile operations to apprehend a number of people, but also to engage in a lot of symbolic activities to convince people across Latin America to not try to enter the United States. And part of that has been to stop using only commercial aircraft to deport people, but to actually also use military aircraft. And there's some evidence that the way migrants or people who are being deported, the treatment on those flights was worse than on commercial aircraft. There's an interesting element to that, is that using military aircraft is actually more expensive than using commercial aircraft. And the Trump administration has recently announced that it would stop using military aircraft. But the image actually was very powerful and produced huge debates across Latin American societies, a lot of criticism for the way they were being treated, because sort of other than being illegally in the United States, these people hadn't committed sort of violent crimes. So, chaining people, not allowing people to use the restroom or to drink water on these long flights has been criticized by policymakers in the region. And Colombia's President Petro in particular criticized Trump for the way in which Colombians were being treated on those military flights, and turned back a couple of flights. And Petro and Trump both, who like to use social media. I think Petro is also somebody who is, very emotional about these things, and got into a social media fight basically with Trump. And Trump immediately threatened tariffs. The Colombian economy is very dependent on the United States, and that forced Petro to back down. And it has since become sort of the symbol of how not to engage with Trump, is to confront Trump publicly head-on is definitely the wrong way to do it. And a lot of Latin American leaders are now saying sort of we should rather use the Scheinbaum model. The Mexican president has been kind of firm, but not very combative, very much focused on data, calm when she's dealing with Trump, very different from Petro. But I think another lesson is that this humiliating treatment, the threatening tariffs, and attacking Petro that way in a very asymmetric relationship may produce also kind of a rally around the flag effect and sort of anti-Americanism. So I think it's premature to say that Trump won and Petro lost, because Petro was also able to mobilize his followers in this sort of in this moment of where you may see increased nationalism across Latin America vis-a-vis particularly the U.S. strategy towards the region.
Okay, that's fascinating. I really wanted to get into how Petro's policy, the stance that he took, was perceived domestically by his own people. And it seems like while initially there may have been a rally around the flag, it is seen as having been unsuccessful. And there's some rethinking there. I also thought it was interesting that in his address to Congress, I think a couple of weeks ago, President Trump made the point that you made at the outset there, that really these measures were aimed at deterrence, deterring migrants from even attempting to cross the border. And so he would frame them as having been successful, and maybe that's his reasoning for why they can now also back down from using military flights and the symbolicism of these dehumanizing measures. I mean, how do you think, going back to how the region is now rethinking their approach to Trump 2.0, first, I'm interested in how this differs from the first Trump administration. What were the lessons learned there, and does the region feel like it's markedly different now? Is it a different president, a different administration, and are they changing their policy responding to that? And then I want to talk about annexation threats, but maybe we'll go with the first question first.
So the first issue is that from a Latin American perspective, Trump is instantly familiar and recognizable. He's a very Latin American leader. We've had people like that for centuries, right? It's like a very personalistic strongman. People basically say, trust me, don't trust the system. I may change my opinion. So it's not you supporting me because I'm aligned with your policy preference, but you trust me. And we've had that with Fujimori in Chile, with Chavez in Venezuela, with Getulio Vargas in Brazil, with Perón. People who would actually change their opinion in some instances quite radically. People who couldn't even be always, you wouldn't always be conservative or left-wing or right-wing, but who would have this very loyal following, and who were trusted by a sizable part of the population, and who are really all about themselves, kind of. And so in that sense, I think while Europeans are kind of shocked and trying to make sense of Trump and what is that, from a Brazilian point of view, I think there is a bit of a Latin Americanization of U.S. politics or even global politics going on. So I think that's the first thing. So Trump doesn't cause the kind of perplexity that I sense sometimes talking to even U.S. analysts, right? The second issue is that obviously Trump attacks developing countries in general, Latin America specifically quite regularly, frames Latin America above all as a source of problems. So that's very different from previous administrations, which have always used sort of a sticks and carrots approach. Right now, Trump actually doesn't offer any carrots. He's basically saying, and he was specifically asked, like, what are you offering Latin American countries? And he said, they need us more than we need them. So we don't really have to offer much.
Really interesting point on when people talk about the transactionalism. It's not really transactional.
In that
it's
particular
extortionate,
case,
right?
And this is quite interesting. So traditionally, Latin America, and particularly South America, has been very happy to fly below the radar. Former Brazilian President Fernando Henrique Cardoso once said, the best strategy that we can adopt is to fly below the radar of the United States, because if we get attention, it's the wrong kind of attention. And it's really always striking to me coming to Washington is how absent, the debate about Latin America really is. I mean, it's really not part of the sort of top 10 priorities. Sometimes when it's about migration or organized crime or drugs, or when it's about China's growing influence, right? So I think the predominant strategy now vis-a-vis Trump has been to take a step back. There's been a lot of talk about Latin America, but a lot of policymakers in the region I've talked to also said, Bush was like that too. He really, he wanted to emphasize Latin America. He was from Texas, and then 9/11 happened, and basically the U.S. forgot about Latin America. And there's a bit of hope that may occur again if things in the Middle East or Europe or Asia, if crises emerge, then it's the first region where people say, okay, let's not, pay too much attention. And I think that there are some signs that may come to pass again, because even though Rubio personally cares a lot about Latin America, he may be involved in all sorts of other issues, which are, of course, more important. Now, the Trump 2.0 is fundamentally different from the first Trump administration because of the threats, which are really of a different dimension of sort of threatening to invade Panama, which has already happened in 1989, but which I think a lot of people also in Latin America believe that this kind of talk or this kind of threat was a thing of the past. That despite a lot of friction and occasional U.S. intervention, the Monroe Doctrine is a very long-standing U.S. policy towards Latin America, particularly during the 20th century, that we've kind of graduated from this stage, and I think that has produced a lot of concern, and the initial reaction, particularly in South America, is to hedge. I think it's more difficult for Mexico and Central America, which are hugely dependent on the United States, where it's really, you can't run away from this problem. Mexico can't suddenly say, let's change our entire economy and, let's start selling to China, for example. You can't do that. But let's say south of Colombia, the instinct is to say, in the context of a threatening northern neighbor, we really want to make sure to have alternatives. So I think a lot of countries are sort of saying, we want to preserve our relationship to the United States, but we also want to make sure we're on better terms with the Europeans, the Chinese, even the Russians, because the more options, the better, basically.
Yeah. And I think the second half of this conversation, I really want to focus on alternatives and China in the region and how sort of long-term alliances are changing. But there are two things that in your answer that I thought were super interesting that I wanted to pick up on. One is this idea of, you called it the Latin Americanization of U.S. or global politics, and the striking sense that I had when I first moved to D.C., how absent Latin America is from the debate here. in my conversations with Europeans, there's a narrative that keeps coming up of maybe we can learn from Latin America in terms of what to expect from the United States, right? So I guess my question is, Europeans had very high expectations of the US as an alliance power, as a stable values and interest partner. To what extent would you say is Latin America not just not surprised because they know this type of individual leader, but also because their expectations of the United States weren't necessarily as high as those of other regions? I guess another way of framing this is how different is this approach to other democratic administrations in the past?
Yeah, that's a really good point, because I sense that a lot of the despair you can sense in Europe about, this period, this golden age is ending now, is of course interpreted in a very different way across the global South, actually, but including Latin America, where I think there is less. Sometimes in informal settings, sort of policymakers even say, well, it's quite refreshing, Trump, because he, doesn't use this moralizing language. He's not hectoring. He's not projecting the U.S. as morally superior.
He doesn't dress up the pig.
Exactly. It's sort of, it is what it is. He's very frank. So in that sense, I think there is a perception in the global South that, interestingly enough, sort of saying that Trump is quote unquote more honest about sort of U.S. national interest. At the same time, I think that there's also a perception that the international order and international law was hugely important for Latin American countries. I mean, these are countries which don't have a lot of hard power. I mean, Brazil is a massive power in terms of size. It's economically relevant. It really spends very little on its defense, and its first line of defense are international institutions, is international law. It prides itself on being capable of defending its national interest at multilateral fora, like the World Trade Organization, for example. With all of that collapsing, I think it's a much less comfortable world for Latin America now. The transition from sort of the liberal consensus to Trump from a Latin American perspective, to some extent, also is not that large, because we've had the United States intervening and many times not in favor of democracy over the 20th century, with the U.S. playing a key role in facilitating the coup in Brazil in the 60s, in Chile, in Uruguay, etc. So, while the Europeans are in this moment of shock and really being sort of expelled from the geopolitical paradise they've lived in, I think the Latin American reaction is, this was in many ways a useful order, but it was far from perfect, and many times we were negatively affected by it. And an interesting example is that when the Berlin Wall fell and so the Soviet Union collapsed, there was euphoria in Europe, and in Latin America there was a sense of apprehension, because from a Latin American point of view, the best way to contain the United States is multipolarity, or at least bipolarity, having another large power that can be used so that we have options, we can somehow utilize our ties to other great powers to deal with the United States. Our second line of defense is international law. But if we just have that in a unipolar world, it's very hard to convince the United States to always, play by the rules. So that's why the way Latin Americans think about the rise of China, or even the resurgence of Russia, is seen very differently. It's actually oftentimes seen as an opportunity. And that's where Europeans and Latin Americans often clash, because Europeans tell Latin Americans, why aren't you tougher on Russia? Because that's a violation of international law, which is very important to Latin Americans. Latin Americans say, well, yes, but we are also kind of happy to see Putin. Well, now things may change, but at least over the past years, to see kind of a more active Putin constraining the United States to some extent, because that's crucial for us in this hugely asymmetrical relationship to the United States.
Fascinating. And before we get into relationships with the other poles in a multipolar system, Russia, China, I did want to pick up on the security threats that might be felt in the region right now from those annexation fantasies or plans. Lots of people here in DC are trying to parse how best to understand President Trump's foreign policy vision and his motivations, whether it is deal making, whether it is business interests. And there is one scenario in which it is an imperialist ambition for the Western Hemisphere that might include military annexation of some territories from Greenland to Panama, Canada. How is that interpreted in the region?
Well, the first issue, which I think is always important to remember, is that Latin America or the United States can't solve the massive problems afflicting the Western Hemisphere without working together. So, for example, the fight against transnational crime must involve the United States cooperating with Latin America because they're part of the same problem, right? You have the U.S. is is the key consumer of cocaine in the world, for example, and that obviously produces a whole industry that involves the United States, which often makes it extremely difficult for a small country in like Central America to stand up to, cartels, which are often have more financial firepower than the president of that particular country, right? And is capable of co-opting the judiciary, of threatening the government. And for years, we've been in touch with policymakers in Central America in particular who say there's no way these countries can ever address this problem without cooperating with the United States, without cooperating with South American governments. So any situation in which the friction between countries in the hemisphere leads to a point where that cooperation suffers is bad news for everyone. It's a lose-lose situation, which is why development cooperation, interagency cooperation is so important. I mean, sharing intelligence with Latin American governments is really crucial. So even the temporary aid freeze from the United States with Colombia immediately created problems for Brazilian border security and facilitated the role of illegal mining, illegal logging, people smuggling. All of these are regional problems, and they require a regional response. And that's, I think, the first thing. There's tension within the Trump government right now because you have this isolationist urge, but you also have an extremely interventionist expansionist component. So you have people who say, let's pull back. But then you have Trump saying, we want to annex Canada, Panama, Greenland, Gaza, and also Elon Musk being very forthright in seeking to influence political developments in countries like Germany, and an expectation that will happen also in Brazil. So some people call it the kind of isolationist neo-imperialism, which is very contradictory in terms. So I think a lot of hope that by offering Trump symbolic victories, and some are quite substantial. I mean, forcing a Hong Kong-based companies to sell the port operation to an American company at the Panama Canal, leaving the Belt and Road Initiative, which is largely symbolic. But the hope that these kinds of things can appease the Trump administration, because Panama cannot really. Should definitely not engage in kind of the petro-style politics, but it can't. It's too dependent. It's too exposed to the United States to actually look for other partners. So I think the hope is that will be enough. The problem is that there is, because of history, a deep-seated and very fertile ground for anti-Americanism, and that the ones that are losing out right now are the ones in Latin American capitals really trying to make the case for deeper, better cooperation with Washington, right? And the ones which are strengthened are the ones to say we can never trust the United States. We must, buy more weapons from China. We must reduce our relationship because it's seen as very threatening, and it's very hard to tell. Is this just bluster? Because these are very serious threats for countries which have literally no real capacity to defend themselves against like a potential military threat from the United States. So I'm talking to, Colombian, Brazilian, Ecuadorian, Peruvian military officials who say, maybe he's talking about Panama today and tomorrow he's talking about the Amazon. Now, I personally think that's very unlikely, but from a national security perspective, you have to kind of think through these scenarios. And I think that diversifying away from U.S. military equipment is a big topic right now, even though Latin American militaries predominantly prefer U.S. military equipment. But there is a sense that, for these modern weapons, you need almost weekly software updates. And if you suddenly have a bad relationship with the United States, they can block that. Suddenly you lose access to your own weapons. So there is that talk going on, even though most military leaders don't like Chinese weapons. A lot of talk about expanding cooperation with the Europeans, particularly the French, also some of the Nordic countries. But this isn't really, considering the massive developmental changes challenges Latin America faces, this shouldn't be an area where we spend more money on, right? About a little less than half of the Brazilian population still doesn't have access to treated sewage, right? This is not a country that should be spending or thinking about, let's diversify our military equipment providers in order to protect ourselves better against the United States. So this is a bit of a loss there, because the more you spend on the military, the smaller the social returns of your investment, of course. So a lot of apprehension.
Fascinating. Okay, we're going to take a short break now, and then we will talk more about the region's interests in diversification and what that might mean for the future of U.S. influence.
This is George Perkovich. For 3 decades, the Carnegie Nuclear Policy Conference has helped government officials, journalists, NGOs, industry, scholars, and students to debate and understand the latest risks and possible pathways to managing them. This year's conference will be held on April 21 and 22. Registration is open, but seating is limited. For more information on the program and to register, go to carnegieendowment.org/NPC2025.
Thanks for listening to The World Unpacked from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. If you enjoy the show, make sure to check out other audio series and podcasts from Carnegie. Subscribe to Carnegie podcasts on popular podcast platforms such as iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Now back to the show. We're back with Oliver Stuenkel to talk about China, first of all. You mentioned in a recent foreign policy article that China could emerge as a more attractive partner for Latin America if Trump continues this heavy-headed approach. Maybe talk us through a little bit, what does China's presence in the region look like now, and how is Beijing positioning itself as an alternative partner?
So China didn't really have a strong presence until the turn of the century. And then because of massive demand for commodities, emerged as a key player, and within a decade became the most important trading partner of Brazil and Chile and several others. And that was a big challenge for Latin America, where there were no China specialists, no sinologists, unknown entity, but also a huge opportunity. The commodity boom lifted, millions and millions of Latin Americans out of poverty. You had a very optimistic period. We like to say that in Latin America, each generation has one commodity boom, and you suddenly earn more money, and you would spend more, and it's really an unforgettable period of time. Your currency is suddenly worth a lot. You can travel the world. And that was sort of in the late 2000s. And then, of course, all these commodity cycles, they are not sustainable, and neither was this one. But it really, China transformed the economy of Latin America. Now continues to be by far the most important trading partner of Brazil. Brazil, for example, exports more to China than it does to Europe and the United States combined. That, of course, is a highly unequal relationship. So it's exporting a lot of iron ore and importing a lot of cars. So that's obviously is a problem. But it is seen largely positively, also because China is so far away. The rhetoric about the Chinese threat doesn't really resonate. And there was a lot of interesting developments during the first Trump administration when there was really a conscious effort by the United States to warn Latin Americans, sort of say, you must be careful with the Chinese, et cetera. And it just didn't really make sense from a Latin American perspective because the primary security threat, and that's not an anti-American statement to make, is that even a pro-American Latin American diplomat would say, well, our primary security concern, in addition to obviously, organized crime and all these kinds of things from a geopolitical point of view, is the United States. It's not China. It's not Russia, because they're so close, so powerful, that the risk of them sort of intervening in our politics is just more significant to us. So having a strong China is actually a plus for us because it gives us more strategic autonomy, more wiggle room, basically. The kind of backlash against China that we saw in Africa over the past sort of 2 decades, and debt trap, shoddy quality of infrastructure hasn't really materialized as much. And and there's questions like, but aren't you concerned about the Chinese building one port after the other? I sometimes respond, well, is there a U.S. company willing to build these things? And there isn't really a competition, And it was quite funny when when Trump won, Xi Jinping was in Peru and opened this massive port. And the language China employs in Latin America is very sophisticated. It's completely opposed to any kind of interventionism. So it's always like, we respect your sovereignty. We're also a developing country. We just emerged from a very similar situation you're in right now. So if you're a governor and you're taken to a trip to China, you look at that and say, if I'm able to pull that off in my state, I've basically got my reelection, guaranteed. So there's just some attractiveness despite the huge differences. And I think it's important to underline that doesn't mean young Latin Americans want to migrate to China. That doesn't mean they're interested in Chinese culture.
It's not the soft power.
Not the soft power at all.
Yeah.
I, for years, headed our university's international exchange program. And, the number of Latin Americans who want to spend a year or two or a semester or two in China is tiny. And those who come back don't really say this is a great experience. We've been kind of isolated, the international students. We didn't really get to know many Chinese students, whereas the vast majority wants to go to the United States and Europe. But that shouldn't lead U.S. policymakers to say, well, the Latin Americans will inevitably side with U.S. foreign policy priorities.
But you know the debate in the region well, but you also know the debate here in D.C. well. And do you think that the heavy Chinese presence, heavy Chinese investment in the region, is that going to ring alarm bells with even this administration that, has characterized China as its pacing threat?
Yeah, absolutely. China now plays a hugely influential role, which makes it very difficult for policymakers to, criticize or to actually make decisions that would move their country away from China or, let's say, impose restrictions on Chinese investment. Very difficult. And a key example is President Bolsonaro got elected as the most pro-American president in Brazilian history. Basically called for automatic alignment, right? He traveled to Taiwan during the campaign to say, we will stop dealing with communist regimes, like very anti-China, gets elected. And then Brazilian elites, business elites, basically talk to the president-elect and say, you know what, it's fine to criticize China like that, but we're really dependent on China. So and interestingly enough, a key part of his coalition, agribusiness, completely dependent on China, right? So what happened is that during Bolsonaro's time in power, trade between Brazil and China increased, actually. He didn't take Brazil out of the BRICS grouping, for example, because business leaders said it's really important that you get to talk to Xi Jinping on a regular basis and tell him what we need. And these are things like, making it easier for Brazilian beef to be sold at Chinese supermarkets and selling our soy and all these kinds of things. So, making it easier for us in the Chinese market. We can't leave BRICS, the grouping that includes Brazil and China, because it's just economically too important. So I think recognizing that is important to think realistically about what's possible, because, as I say, Latin American governments face tremendous short-term development challenges. I mean, huge, and this is only going to increase because of the climate crisis. If you have you have a rigorous migration policy and people can't leave, you have potentially even more volatile labor markets. This may, destabilize some countries. You have less cooperation. The Latin American government's capacity to combat organized crime will decrease. So, very challenging environment. And I think as a U.S. policymaker sitting down with a Latin American policymaker, it's important to say these people are really facing a lot of immediate challenges. So saying, be careful with your Huawei chips doesn't sort of it doesn't connect to the key concerns that these decision makers are facing.
Yeah, I think that's a really key point. Really understanding what actually are the concerns and interests of the region when you talk to them about wanting to curtail Chinese influence. Taking a step back, maybe from Chinese influence, we've talked about the region wanting to diversify beyond the region, beyond the United States. But how do you see the pressure from the Trump administration impacting intra-regional coordination and cooperation? Is there a divide and conquer, or are countries banding together? What do you see?
I think the first concern among policymakers I've spoken to over the past month is the emergence of Trump copycats. I mean, that's sort of the first thing that given the situation in Latin America, you always have a fertile environment for sort of populists who temporarily may destabilize politics. So that's the first thing. The second thing is in Latin America, it's sort of seen as a region, but these are countries which are not complementary economically. They're competing for access to the Chinese market, to the U.S. market. It's also physically there's no real physical infrastructure present that actually connects the region. There's a mall, a shopping mall in Buenos Aires called Pacifico, and it's that was built initially as a train station because that's where the train to the Pacific was supposed to start. It never actually materialized. And interestingly enough, I think at some point China will be crucial to fund the construction of actually connecting Latin America. But the incentive to work together has traditionally been very low, and it's really quite interesting that we don't really have the kinds of institutions that would be important to create kind of elite connections. For example, if you're a really smart student in Paraguay, you don't want to go to university in Brazil. You want to go to the United States, right? So again, with trying to convince my students in the past to do their exchange programs in Argentina or Peru, very little demand. So it's not really so the few institutions that would make it possible to actually unite. There were a couple of people when the United States threatened Panama, a couple of governments that tried to respond cohesively. But then Milei, who's obviously a Trump ally, and Bukele in El Salvador sort of said, we're unwilling to sign a document which could be seen as anti-American, basically. And particularly when leaders have diverging ideological views, cooperation has usually suffered. There's, I think, on a technical level, there is some cooperation going on. So law enforcement, these kinds of things, migration policies. There's, because of the migratory crisis coming from Venezuela, there's some cooperation going on. But as a percentage of the total trade, inter-regional trade has actually gone down. Whereas for Brazil, to see that this is not a black and white story. So for Brazil, China is actually also a competitor in other parts of Latin America, because Brazilian companies during the commodity boom were beginning to be more present in neighboring countries, but they've been kind of pushed aside increasingly by Chinese companies. So I wouldn't expect Latin America to be able to articulate a joint position. Maybe some minilateral groups in South America, but the incentives and the geopolitical realities of Mexico and Central America are fundamentally different from those in South America, which is why I always tell people in the State Department, it really makes little sense to have an undersecretary of Western Hemisphere, because these are regions which are completely different from these tiny countries in the Caribbean and Brazil, right? And no one person should be trying to coordinate a policy towards this whole region. So no, I think it's going to be quite fragmented, in particular once the return of Trump, and I suspect that may happen, increases polarization within Latin American societies. We have a Brazilian election coming up next year, and you will have a conservative candidate, I think, who will embrace a lot of the views that Trump is articulating, and then sort of on the other side, you will have kind of an anti-Trump candidate. And then and in other countries, there's elections too. So in some countries, you may have kind of a pro-Trump candidate, and others an anti, and that will make, genuine high-level cooperation very difficult. So right now, for example, the president of Argentina is not really on talking terms with the president of Brazil because of these ideological differences.
That's fascinating. So U.S. politics as a sort of organizing force in Latin American politics.
Yeah, and it's highly visible. It's being talked about in the news every day. And that's also, interestingly enough, a challenge I mentioned this very briefly. Latin American elites are profoundly U.S.-centric or Western-centric. Also know a lot about Europe. But largely, we don't really have experts, or we don't really have a sort of a class of sinologists or Asia specialists or Africa specialists to make sense of what's going on in other parts of the world. And that, I think, leads to a situation which sort of more pro-American voices say all the good stuff that happens is because of the United States, and anti say all the bad stuff that happens. But many times
other factors aren't considered. The
United States has been losing influence in Latin America for quite a while. I would say today China is probably more influential in the region than the U.S. So it's sort of, for a Brazilian president to actually kind of speak out or to take action against China would be politically more costly than vis-a-vis the United States.
Oliver, this has been fascinating. There's so much more we could talk about. Just in your last answer, I made notes and I have 15 follow-up questions, but we don't have the time in this podcast, I'm afraid. So we'll have to have you back.
Absolutely.
There is, I don't know if you've been warned about this, but I do like to ask our guests if there's a book or a paper they would recommend to our listeners who have maybe an interest in the topics that we've discussed. Feel free to recommend your own writing.
There's an article coming out this week for Foreign Policy is about the BRICS grouping, the future of the BRICS grouping. Brazil is now hosting a BRICS summit in July. It's the expanded BRICS grouping. It involves Russia, China, India, but now recently also as a new member, Indonesia. And they are seeking to jointly make sense of Trump. But the interesting tension, and I think that's why Latin America, it can be an important partner to the United States, is that the division within the BRICS grouping is between a bloc led by China, Russia, until recently, Russia and Iran as kind of a more anti-Western bloc, and India, South Africa, and Brazil, a bloc that doesn't want to oppose the West, but actually seeks some kind of multi-alignment, preserving the ties to the West. And I think in that sense, it continues to be hugely important for the United States to engage the democracies in the Global South. And Latin America is the most democratic region in the Global South.
Fascinating. Oliver, thank you so much. I look forward to having you back in the future.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you.
You have been listening to The World Unpacked, an audio production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Views expressed are those of the host and guest panelists and not necessarily those of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Subscribe to Carnegie podcasts on popular podcast platforms such as iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you listen to podcasts. You can find our episodes on Carnegie's YouTube channel as well. Learn more at thecarnegieendowment.org. Thanks to the excellent Hyewon Park, who is our audio engineer and executive producer, and to Cameron Zotter, who is our videographer. I'm Sophia Besch, Senior Fellow in the Euro Program and host of The World Unpacked. Thanks for listening.